Most people who buy Bitcoin think they have opted out of the system. In reality, many of them have only changed the asset while keeping the same behavioral architecture: centralized custody, permanent traceability, weak digital discipline, and a false sense of privacy. That is the real vulnerability. They assume Bitcoin is private because it is decentralized. They assume ownership implies invisibility. They assume self-custody, if they ever reach it, solves the entire problem. It does not. Bitcoin is transparent by design, the ledger is public, the transaction graph is permanent. What changes is not whether information exists, but whether your behavior makes that information easy to map back to you. And for most people, it does. The modern user typically enters through a regulated exchange, completes full identity verification, connects bank accounts, and reuses addresses carelessly. Then he leaks metadata through normal browsing habits and wonders why sovereignty still feels fragile. The problem is not Bitcoin. The problem is that most people import a surveillance-shaped financial life into a transparent monetary network and expect a different outcome. That creates custody risk, privacy risk, and counterparty exposure at the same time. Custody risk remains because coins left on centralized platforms are still subject to freeze, seizure, insolvency, policy change, and administrative restriction. Privacy risk remains because acquisition and withdrawal patterns create identifiable data trails. Counterparty exposure remains because convenience keeps the user dependent on institutions that can observe, report, restrict, or delay access. This is where many people confuse possession with sovereignty. Owning Bitcoin on paper is not the same as controlling it under stress. Moving coins once to a wallet is not the same as building an architecture that protects against behavioral leakage, liquidity shocks, or jurisdictional pressure. And privacy in this context is not a binary condition. It is not something you have or do not have. It is a gradient shaped by conduct. For most people, Bitcoin privacy is a myth not because the system failed, but because their habits never changed. They still operate with single points of failure, single narratives of safety, and single layers of access. That becomes dangerous the moment conditions change. An exchange can freeze withdrawals. A regulator can expand reporting standards. A tax authority can narrow the space between transaction history and personal identity. A simple operational mistake can connect wallets, balances, and behaviors that were never meant to be linked. And once linked, that trail does not disappear. The structural weakness is simple. People seek monetary independence without redesigning the system of behaviors that surround money. That is why the conversation has to move beyond slogans. Privacy is not created by owning a scarce asset. It is created by building a disciplined structure around custody, liquidity, identity, and digital behavior. Without that structure, most users are not sovereign, they are merely exposed in a new format. A resilient structure starts with layering. Not because layering sounds sophisticated, but because concentration creates fragility. Whenever one tool, one platform, one wallet, one jurisdiction, or one assumption carries too much responsibility, the system becomes easy to break. The first layer is the monetary layer. This is your long-duration reserve. Bitcoin in this role is not a trading instrument, it is monetary infrastructure. Its purpose is to provide a reserve outside the balance sheet logic of the fiat system. It mitigates purchasing power erosion, monetary expansion risk, and long-term counterparty debasement. The trade-off is volatility. A reserve asset with asymmetric upside also comes with drawdown risk. If you treat your reserve like daily operating cash, volatility turns conviction into forced liquidation. That is why the reserve layer must not carry responsibilities it was not designed to carry. The second layer is the liquidity layer. This exists so that you do not need to touch long-term reserves under pressure. Its purpose is short-term functionality: bills, emergencies, transition periods, and optionality. A liquidity layer mitigates the risk of becoming a forced seller during moments of market stress or personal instability. The trade-off is degradation. Cash loses value over time. Stable instruments can introduce issuer risk, banking risk, or regulatory risk, depending on how they are held. But the point of this layer is not performance, it is operational continuity. Liquidity buffers by time, and time is one of the most valuable forms of resilience. The third layer is the privacy layer. This is where most people are underbuilt. Its purpose is not invisibility in an absolute sense. Its purpose is friction against unnecessary exposure. It mitigates data consolidation, behavioral mapping, and identity linkage across financial activity. The trade-off is convenience. The more privacy-conscious your behavior becomes, the less seamless your system often feels. There may be more deliberate separation, more process discipline, fewer shortcuts, and less passive trust in default platforms. But that inconvenience is often the cost of reducing traceable patterns. The fourth layer is the redundancy layer. This covers backups, recovery design, device separation, jurisdictional awareness, and operational continuity under failure. Its purpose is to ensure that one mistake, one confiscation event, one travel problem, one platform issue, or one local disruption does not collapse the entire structure. The trade-off is complexity. Redundancy requires thought. It requires procedures. It requires accepting that elegance is not always the highest value. In resilient systems, some complexity is the price paid to avoid catastrophic simplicity. You can also add an asymmetric layer. This is where controlled upside exposure lives, higher-risk strategies, selective DeFi participation, or other convex opportunities. Its purpose is not survival, but optional expansion. It mitigates the risk of having no upside beyond preservation. The trade-off is obvious: increased smart contract risk, counterparty exposure, liquidity fragility, and faster drawdown potential. That is why this layer must remain small enough to fail without damaging the rest. This is the logic of sovereignty: not one wallet, not one app, not one heroic belief. A system of layers where each part has a job, each job has a limit, and no single failure destroys the whole. Most people do the opposite. They merge reserve, liquidity, speculation, identity, and convenience into one fragile cluster. Then they call that freedom. It is not freedom, it is compression of risk. And compressed risk always waits for the wrong moment to reveal itself. Structure fails when conduct fails. That is why sovereignty is not mainly about tools. Tools matter, but behavior determines whether those tools remain protective or become decorative. The first discipline principle is position sizing. The common mistake is emotional overallocation. People see Bitcoin as an answer to systemic fragility and then respond with structural fragility of their own. They allocate beyond their volatility tolerance, beyond their liquidity needs, and beyond their psychological durability. The structural correction is simple: size positions so that drawdowns do not break your decision-making. If a market decline forces you into panic, your allocation was not strategic, it was unstable. Volatility compression only becomes useful when you survive the expansion that comes before it. The second discipline principle is counterparty awareness. The common mistake is outsourcing trust to convenience. Users leave too much capital on exchanges, too much data in custodial systems, and too much operational dependence in institutions that can change rules without asking permission. The structural correction is to separate access from ownership in your thinking. An interface that lets you view your balance is not the same as sovereign control. If a third party can freeze, delay, censor, report, or rehypothecate, then convenience is masking counterparty exposure. The third discipline principle is information hygiene. The common mistake is assuming privacy is only a wallet issue. It is not, it is a behavioral issue. People leak through email habits, reused identifiers, careless device practices, public screenshots, weak compartmentalization, and a general preference for frictionless digital life. The structural correction is to treat information as a form of capital. Every unnecessary linkage between your identity and your financial behavior reduces future optionality. The goal is not paranoia. The goal is to stop donating unnecessary intelligence to systems that already collect more than they need. The fourth discipline principle is avoiding leverage traps. The common mistake is using borrowed exposure to accelerate independence. But leverage often converts temporary volatility into permanent loss. It introduces liquidation risk, timing pressure, and behavioral distortion. The structural correction is to prioritize durability over speed. A sovereign structure does not depend on perfect timing. The moment your system requires markets to behave on schedule, you are no longer building independence. You are building fragility with optimistic branding. The fifth discipline principle is jurisdictional realism. The common mistake is assuming that because Bitcoin is borderless, your life is. It is not. You still live under laws, reporting regimes, tax enforcement, banking rules, and institutional expectations tied to geography. The structural correction is to think in terms of jurisdictional exposure. Where you live, where you bank, where you report, where you store, and where you move all shape the actual operating environment of your capital. Geography is not everything, but ignoring it is amateur thinking. Discipline is what keeps each layer doing its job. Without discipline, reserve capital becomes emergency cash. Liquidity buffers become idle clutter until they disappear. Privacy practices become occasional gestures. Redundancy becomes something you planned, but never tested. And that is how good ideas fail in real life. Not because the framework was wrong, but because the behavior around it remained reactive. A resilient structure has to assume failure scenarios, not because collapse is guaranteed, but because systems should be designed around stress, not comfort. One failure scenario is exchange disruption. This may come through insolvency, withdrawal freezes, legal intervention, technical downtime, or internal fraud. We have already seen variations of this across the digital asset space. The lesson is not that every exchange will fail. The lesson is that exchange reliability is not the same thing as exchange invulnerability. If your reserve sits inside a platform during a period of market stress, then your monetary layer is not a reserve. It is unsecured platform exposure, wearing a familiar logo. The second failure scenario is privacy collapse through traceability. This does not need drama to matter. It can emerge slowly through tighter reporting standards, enhanced analytics, data sharing frameworks, and simple user error. A withdrawal linked to verified identity, combined with repeated behavioral patterns, can narrow the gap between public ledger activity and personal financial mapping. Once that mapping becomes easier, optionality shrinks. Not necessarily today, not necessarily through a dramatic event. But structurally, the cost of future policy shifts rises when your financial graph is already easy to observe. A third scenario is liquidity shock. This can happen at the market level or the personal level. Market-side price declines can create drawdown pressure precisely when fear is highest. Personal-side job loss, relocation, medical events, or business disruption can force bad timing. Without liquidity buffers, even strong long-term convictions can be liquidated by short-term necessity. That is why liquidity is not weakness, it is shock absorption. A fourth scenario is regulatory tightening. This may affect custody rules, tax enforcement, stablecoin access, reporting obligations, or the operational freedom of intermediaries. You do not need to predict the exact mechanism to understand the structural point. Systems built around maximum convenience are highly exposed when compliance requirements expand. The safeguard principle is this: never build a financial life where one institutional decision, one technical failure, or one personal emergency can force total reconfiguration. That is risk containment, not perfect safety, not fantasy protection. Just a structure with enough separation, redundancy, and liquidity to remain functional when one part fails. Bitcoin does not automatically make a person sovereign. It only offers infrastructure that can be used within a sovereign structure. For most people, privacy is still mostly a myth because they entered a new monetary network with the same old habits. Centralization, convenience dependence, weak compartmentalization, and no layered design. That is the real issue. The solution is not emotional purity. It is not ideological performance. And it is not pretending that one tool solves every category of risk. The solution is structural maturity. A monetary layer for long-term resilience. A liquidity layer for operational continuity. A privacy layer for reduced visibility and preserved optionality. A redundancy layer for failure survival. And a disciplined code of conduct strong enough to keep the entire system coherent under stress. Sovereignty is not an event, it is a layered system. The goal is not to escape volatility, it is to remain functional regardless of it. This is 21 Protocol. Freedom is not a feeling, it's a structure. If you don't build yours, they will